unfortunately. There were some, let's call them issues, with the whole switchover to Oracle. And so basically, paperwork didn't get turned in on time. So we are not currently able to offer PACE credits for our classes. We're hoping to have that switched up and turned back on at the beginning of the year. So if anyone saw that and was like, oh, yay, PACE credits, unfortunately, we'll hopefully get that fixed. But like I said, it was just a little bit of a paperwork goof up that happened. It's not that we lost our accreditation or anything like that. Nothing too scary. It just, we didn't get things done on time. I'm sure we've all been there too. And it's like, oh heck, my license was up for renewal 2 months ago. I need to go do that. That happened to me during the pandemic. I had to get my driver's license renewed, and then it came and went because you had to make an appointment at the DMV, and they of course didn't have any appointments open. So yeah, I can understand, but it's kind of a bummer for folks that were expecting that. So you can ignore that particular part if they did, in fact, leave those slides there in the slide deck. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple of minutes here and just kind of do a little bit of review slash overview, I guess, of some of the core concepts, just to kind of refresh our brains on some things. And a lot of this isn't so much build that we would necessarily be doing as lab analysts, but it still is going to be important. It's kind of like someone else is going to come and lay the foundation, and then we're going to build onto that. So oftentimes this is responsibility of other teams at your organization, but still worth to kind of know that yes, this is potentially going to be affecting what I'm doing. And just a little heads up for you guys, one thing that I am so not a fan of about Zoom is I don't get any like little notification pop-ups or like sounds that let me know that someone sent a chat message. So if you put something there in the chat and it's been a while and I haven't noticed it, you can poke me, raise your hand with a little reaction button, something like that. It's probably that I didn't notice. I get like I either can have the chat open and then I just potentially don't see that a new message was up there, or if I close the chat, I just get a little badge on the chat. So that is one thing I wish they would change, but apparently a lot of people wish that Zoom would change that, and they haven't. So you'd think it's a simple function. It's like, how often do we get notifications, sounds, or everything else? But they can't seem to figure out how to do that. So just to kind of let you know, I might be a little bit slow at responding to those chat messages. All right. So a couple of things that I would like to point out. We have first, organizations and specifically our facilities. So this is definitely going to be one of those things. It's usually the responsibility of like a core team or something similar to that. You might call it something different at your site, but they're going to be handling a lot of that central build to our Millennium system. These are going to be what a lot of build throughout the Millennium system kind of revolves around. There's a number of different places where we can like customize what our system does based on the organization, based on the facility, sometimes based on individual locations within those facilities. Now, for us, for lab side, one thing that we do is we take those patient care locations and we use them to build what we call service areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a little while. But those service areas are going to help us determine which locations, patient locations, get tested by which of our service resources. This is especially going to be relevant for those of you guys that have multi-facility systems, potentially with multiple different labs, because it's going to help drive, okay, when can this test be done at this facility? When does this test need to be done at this other facility? And so we drive that based on the locations of the facility. There's a few other things, especially once we get into orders and building out those orders, that are also going to be dependent on those facilities too. So they pop up when you least expect them. It's like, oh, hey, there's an option for me to choose a facility. So, like I said, not really anything that we would be building, but it does help to kind of know what's out there. Sometimes updates to those facilities and those patient care locations are things that we're also going to have to consider. They build out a new unit in the hospital, then we're going to have to update that within our build and make sure that we kind of compensate for that in our build. Okay. Next thing I put in here, and this is something, it's kind of a side effect of learning a lot about pharmacy. I was like, well, I think I'm going to start letting my lab folks know about this. Units of measure. We use units for like just about every solution, whether we're measuring quantities, whether we're measuring volume, distance, time. Units of measure allow us to give context to numbers, right? We're all familiar with the idea. Technically, in our Millennium system, the units of measure, they all live in the same code set, and they're owned by pharmacy. Because if you look at the big old code set, I think it's code set 54 is the number, in case you're curious. A lot of those are things that pharmacy uses for the different types of dosing of medications. We, of course, use units of measure in the lab, too. And we do piggyback on a lot of the really common ones. We do a lot of milliliters. We do, various different weight measurements sometimes and all of that. We use units for our different tests and providing context for the measurements that we're getting, whether it's a sodium level or a count of white blood cells or red blood cells. But the reason I bring this up is every so often we come across new units of measure. It's not an everyday sort of thing, but it does happen. And sometimes it's a lab unit of measure and be like, oh, hey, we need to, add this in. It's this new test and we're measuring it in a new way. What I always recommend to folks is that you double check with your pharmacy team. Send them a quick ping message, or if you have to go through a whole like change control ticket or whatever, it's a lot easier to kind of check first than have to have them go in and fix something that we've done. Because for us on the lab side, a unit of measure is just, this says milligrams, this says milliliters. It's just a little label that we attach to a number. But on the pharmacy side, there's extra stuff that they have to do. And it is so much easier to do that right from the start than have to go back in and fix it. So if you say, hey, pharmacy friend, I've got this new unit I need to add. Is it okay if I go ahead and add it? Or do you need to do this on your side? It's a pretty quick and easy little question, right? And a lot of times they may say, no, just you can go ahead and add that in Core Code Builder, no big deal. And then we're fine. But maybe every once in a blue moon, you might come across a situation where they say, oh, hey, we also need to add that. So we'll get it done. We'll let you know when we're finished and you'll be good to go. Because like I said, they have extra stuff that they need to do. And I would be remiss if I just completely left my pharmacy analysts in the dark and said, no, just add it. It's fine. It won't affect anybody. Well, yeah, it probably will. Right. So just a little bit of a heads up. And there's other code sets out there kind of like that, but that's going to be the big one I found that really, because there's so much more that we have to do. There's a lot of background build that we have to do to units on the pharmacy side. So easier to just get it out of the way. All right. And then security. Most of the security that we have for our lab applications is going to be controlled via our task access. So various different applications, tasks that are granted and revoked for different users, pretty basic stuff. But there are a couple of things that can occasionally become an issue just because maybe you don't realize that there are some security settings at play. So I figured I'd talk about a couple of those, and I think I actually have a slide set aside for those so that we could take a look at it. So this is just a quick little screenshot out of that units of measure tool on the pharmacy side, just so you can kind of see some of what I'm talking about, right? For each of those units of measure, we not only have to build the unit, build the code value, but we also have to indicate these little attributes that kind of controls how the unit acts in the pharmacy tools. There's some other stuff that we also have to do in Bedrock. So it's a little bit more than you might think. And we don't have to do that for lab units of measure. So if it's something like number of vials for I don't know what, or any of the lab specific units we use, it's just better to be safe than sorry would be a good way to say that. And then there's my little security slide. I knew it was in here somewhere. So like I said, main thing that we are concerned with as far as lab security is going to be our application and task access. That is what controls the vast majority of what our users are able to do, what they're not able to do. But we also have some of these others. And I figured I'd throw in a couple of things you guys might remember from your fundamentals class, because they actually are going to be a thing that affects our lab applications. Now, as a general rule, before we talk about the exceptions, on the lab side, we do try and keep our lab users, our med techs and so on, able to see whatever patients they're going to need to be able to see. They're going to be able to enter whatever results they're going to need to enter. We don't try and purposely limit their workflow. In fact, some of the applications, like a session result entry, it could care less about things like encounter org security, because it doesn't really matter where the patient is, if the patient's at a regular med-surg unit or if the patient's a behavioral health unit. We need to do their CBC. We need to do their CBC. Where they are doesn't really matter. But it's other things that sometimes may potentially be a little bit restrictive. So I like to bring it up just in case you ever run into like a question from the lab folks, or a troubleshooting ticket that comes through. So encounter org security, like I said, you guys might remember these from your fundamentals class. This is where you have certain encounters that are only viewable based on the organizations that the user is associated to. Like I said, try and keep this all available for our lab users, but every so often, what could happen is that they log into, say a session result entry to put in some results, and they can do that just fine. But then they go over to order result viewer to view those results, and they can't see it. And it's like, what's going on here? That is actually the encounter org security doing its job. So order result viewer does actually look at some of these security settings. And so I've actually seen that happen on some of the times I've been on the like end user conversions and things like that, where they can put in the results, they can pull the results across from the instrument, but they go into ORV, it's like, wait, where'd they go? And it's not a, how do I put this? The system is working the way it's designed. Let's put it that way. And so something to look out for. I occasionally run into that even in our train domain, because I know that encounter org security is turned in on our train domain. So I'll be trying to access a patient, just a test patient, and I can't see their results, and it's because of that. So that would just be a matter of reevaluating the organizations that particular user is associated to. Do we have them limited in some way that maybe we don't, we shouldn't? There's also going to be some orderable item security that can also take place. And when we talk about privileges, most of the time privileges only affect PowerChart or the PowerChart framework. And most of the time our lab folks aren't getting into PowerChart unless they're using, like PowerChart specimen collection as a phlebotomist. However, order, result viewer, again, ORV causing us issues, does actually look at some of those orderable related privileges. So you could run into a situation where the user is able to enter results, let's say for an HIV screen, but then they go over to ORV and they don't see it. It doesn't pop up, right? So that can also happen with specifically flow sheet mode. If you're not familiar with the different modes of the tool, we'll see them here in a little bit. But flow sheet mode also looks at the results review privileges. So there's a couple of things that are going to sometimes cause us issues, but hopefully we manage to catch some of those when we're doing go lives and all of that. But sometimes it's a test that's not super common, like one of the HIV screens or something like that, and it's like, oh, my user can't see that. So just a security fix, not too big of a deal. Sometimes it's set that way on purpose, and that's just a training conversation we have to have. So figured I'd bring it up. Like I said, I've run into that with end user training before, and it's just one of those things that we don't really think too terribly much about. If security is working correctly, you never have to think about it. It just does what it needs to do. But every so often it's not working correctly. It's not working the way we expect it to work. So that's what I have to say about that. Kind of the same vein as talking about security. We have a Bedrock. So Bedrock is actually a little bit different, more from our side of things. Bedrock actually has its own security. Now, we're going to be talking about quite a bit of the Bedrock build that we can do for GenLab. It is the recommended approach for Cerner / Oracle. But if you happen to notice that the available options that you have on your own system are different than what you see in our train domain, then that's something to discuss with whoever handles your Bedrock security. Probably the same security team, but it is actually controlled differently. It's not the same as regular task access. So anyway, just a little note about that. Bedrock, like I said, is going to be Cerner's recommended design and build approach for a lot of reasons. If we went through the effort of building out a Bedrock wizard, there's probably a good reason why. And with GenLab, it's kind of interesting because a lot of folks that may have built orders before, you probably have done so in DCP tools, or you've heard of people using DCP tools to do order build. And that's fine. It works. There's a lot of things in our system that you have multiple options. But I find that Bedrock is much more streamlined. It's like if you build your GenLab order in DCP tools, okay, well, you've built out the orderable, but now you have to go somewhere else to build out your DTAs, to build out your routing, to build out your collections. And it's like you're doing a lot of hop, skipping, and jumping between different tools. Whereas if we use Bedrock, a lot of the build is all in one place. It's just a matter of opening up different wizards within the same application. So I like that. It makes things a lot easier. With the caveat that there is potentially a few things that may still need to be done in DCP tools. Our Bedrock team has this weird habit of giving us most of the build that we need to do in Bedrock, but leaving some things out. I don't know why they do that. I know they have their own priorities, just like the rest of us do. And for some reason, sometimes things like nurse review and physician cosign that really only affect the power chart side of the workflow, well, it still has to be done. It's just we can't see it from our side in Bedrock. So why they left that out, I don't know. There's a lot of things that sometimes my answer is, I don't know. And the person that probably made that executive decision doesn't even work here anymore. And priorities, of course, have changed. So I am going to be going over the Bedrock version. of how our build should be done. But just note that it is possible that you may have done or have seen done build in other tools as well. But I find Bedrock to be a much easier way of doing things overall. So these are going to be the various different GenLab wizards available to us. We will be talking about most of them. We won't be able to cover the reference lab side because you do have to have like the actual link up to the reference lab interface for that to work, and we don't have that in our train domain. We don't have any interfaces, in fact. Let's see, probably won't have time to go over anything related to the link codes, but assigning the link codes is not the hard part. It's knowing what they need to be, and that's going to come from lab directors, supervisors, whoever makes those sorts of decisions. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, link codes they're standardization codes for our assays, and similar to how we use, like coding for like SNOMED, for diagnoses, but these are just going to be to the individual assay level, and they get assigned, and we can do that there in the wizard. The wizard can make you suggestions, but ultimately it comes down to the folks at your site that would be telling it, okay, this code goes to this DTA. And then we won't be taking a look at the Phase X wizards. So if you've not heard that term before, Phase X means that you had an existing, say, power chart implementation, but you hadn't switched over to lab yet on the Cerner side. So you probably had the orders built for power chart to be able to, order a CBC or a CMP or whatever. But since there was no lab solution, none of that got done. And now we're ready to go ahead and implement GenLab. And what those wizards allow you to do is go in and reconcile everything and say, okay, here's the previously built CBC order that we were getting information from, say, SunQuest. Now we want it to be in PathNet. And rather than having to go back and rebuild everything, we could just match those order catalog entries up. And same thing with the DTAs and all of that. So we won't be going over those. They're also pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand if we need to ever use those. So that, I think, is everything in terms of my little introductory slides. So what we will do next is we're going to grab our morning break. It's a nice little time for us to go ahead and do that. And then when we come back, I'm going to take us through a quick little high-level overview of end-user steps. So for some of you guys, it'll probably be a review. For some of you, it'll be like, oh, hey, so this is that thing that people talk about when they talk about entering in results. So it's a good way to kind of start us off, give us an idea of some of the things we are going to be talking about throughout the week. But we'll go ahead and grab, like I said, we'll grab our morning break first. So let me find my handy little timer here. I know that there's a clock somewhere on this device. There it is. Let's put this over here. And let's do this. I'll just share my timer clock thing. Okay, and there we go. So we'll set that for 15 minutes, and I'll see you guys back here. You can go and let the pups out or grab a refresh of your morning beverage of choice. I think that's what I'll do. I'm gonna go make myself a glass of tea and find a snack. So talk to you in a little bit. And like I said, we'll work on that little activity next. Welcome back, everybody. Kind of hard to hear the timer sound when you're in the other room. Got distracted. Was looking for something. I hate it when I know that I have a thing, but then I can't find the thing. And the kittens are no help. I tell them to find it for me, and they just, nope. Can never get them to do what you want them to do. I hear that's what it's like having kids, too. Ah, well, I'll continue my search at lunchtime. Okay, let's see. Let me get this timer out of here. We don't want that in our way. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this first activity here in our participant guide. It is, let's see, somewhere on page 7, it should be. If you notice any differences in any of the page numbers that I give you guys, let me know. It's one of the potential downsides of teaching these classes for so long is I end up with older copies of my guides because I forget to delete them. So that happens every once in a while. But I try and remove those old versions when I can. So thankfully, lab stuff doesn't change too terribly much. A lot of it is very similar to what we've always done. So we are going to be going through this activity together. We're going to be starting with a brief little example of some quality control. So we're going to hop on over to a session result entry. We're going to be in our train domain. Let me get this over here to my other monitor. That would be helpful. All right, somewhere there on that desktop, you'll be able to find a folder. This is Millennium Applications. That's what we're looking for. And then in there, should be right up toward the top, actually. Excuse me, we're looking for a session result entry. Not the debug mode. We don't want the debug. We want just regular session result entry. Here you're going to go ahead and log in with your DL number that I gave you guys earlier. Everybody's password is going to be the same. It's just a password of Cerner. I'm going to maximize my screen there. And so we're going to start, as we often do in the lab, with a little bit of QC. So very important to make sure that the results that we are trying to achieve are accurate. So, excuse me. I'm going to put in the number here. Already kind of pre-prepared one of these sessions. So we'll do QC 11000011. I'll hit that retrieve button. Okay. So we've got all of the assays that are all being tested here on, excuse me, on the same QC a session, we are going to go ahead and we'll just stick with sodium for now. I'm not going to make us go through and do, the whole kit and caboodle sort of thing. So we want to go here to where it says sodium level, and we'll put in a nice in range result. We'll say 130. Okay, then down here at the bottom, we've got our perform and verify buttons. We're going to go ahead and just verify these results. It's going to ask for your, it's going to ask for your password. This is an optional setting we just happen to have turned on in our train domain. So if you're not used to seeing that in the domains you've worked in previously, that's fairly normal. A lot of sites choose to not use that, and that's quite all right. All right, there we go. Now that is done. Easy peasy. So far, so good. Now then, what we'll do is we will go ahead and move on to the next part, which is going to have us place some orders here. Close out of this for now. DEPT, order entry. So department order entry is where we're headed. It helps if I double click on the application, I guess. Excuse me. Make my window a bit bigger. I do that a lot. A person name. All right, we're going to need a test patient. Well, luckily, we have some very easy to remember test patient names. So, if you know your DL number, which you do because you've been able to log into the application, then what you're going to do is you're just going to use that DL number as your patient name with one tiny little change. But we are going to spell out the number. So you're going to use letters instead of numerals. So in my case, I've got the DLFIFTEEN for DL15. Okay. Do a quick little search there, and they should come up. If anybody has any trouble finding their test patient, let me know. So far, so good. So I'm going to come over here to this orderable box. I'm going to order a very simple sodium level. Hit enter. So you get a variety of different things that match my search here. I've got, let's see, sodium level, which would probably be the blood test. I've got a 24-hour urine, a body fluid urine. I want just the regular old sodium level. Nothing fancy, just regular old sodium level. All right, now I fill in some details. So it looks like we want to make this a collection of stat. I want my collected box. Okay, it says put a check in the collected box. So yes, I've collected it. Okay. Down here in my next line, we're going to say that this specimen receive location, well, it's in our RD login, which is a remote draw login. Okay. Let's see, going down, 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 down. An ordering physician that I need to enter. So if I type Carter, comma K, Dr. Kristen Carter will come up. Right. I think that's everything. So I should be able to add this. Right, but then my scratch pen, then I go ahead and submit it. Now, if you get any sort of issue here, maybe it has a bit of a conniption, gives you a red line down there at the bottom. And then what we may want to do is go ahead and if you click on the line and then you go up here to the toolbar, there's going to be like a little red circle with an X in it. And that is where you could just check to make sure that you, whatever issue you have, it'll go ahead and let you know. Usually, if it's causing problems, it's usually the date and time, actually, that does that. Where you'll have like your receive date being like a minute before the collected date. So you can't have something that's received before it's collected. It's impossible. So anyway, assuming that we got everything ordered there, and then we should be good to go. All right. Now then, make sure you make a note of your session number before you close the tool. I mean, it's not an entire deal breaker. If you forgot, we can always look it back up. Not a big deal. But we'll try and avoid that. So next, we're going to go to a session result entry again. Close out of this. Back to session result entry. Sorry, I keep having to mute myself because I got a case of the sneezels today. I don't know what's going on. Fall allergies, I suppose. Okay, so up here, I'm going to put in that session number that I just got. I'm pretty sure mine was 7. And then retrieve. So I did it this way on purpose. When I retrieve that, I'm going to see that my test, my sodium level there, is showing up as not in lab. So what I've got going here is that the specimen, see how I want to put this. The specimen is currently in a place that the system sees as, nope, this isn't going to work. All right, so for every single one of our tests, it's actually the service resource, but we'll talk about that in a little while. The system has a place where that order needs to get to. And once it gets to that place, it's ready to be tested. If it doesn't get to that place, well, then it doesn't get to be tested. So now, that's why it says not in lab. So, excuse me, what I need to do is I need to update this. We're going to go to specimen login to get it to that place where it needs to be. So what we do here is we click on this little specimen login button. It's the one that looks like a left-hand pointing arrow. There's my information. So I just come down here to the bottom. I'm going to put that into the CP login, CP for central processing. Oh, and then we log it in. Excuse me. All right, so that should be good. My login button's grayed out, so it's done. Go back over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh my session by just clicking into the box where the session number is, and then clicking retrieve. And there we go. It should say pending if I did that correctly. All right, now I can put in a result. Let's see, it says we're going to do 170. A little bit high on the sodium level there, patient. All right. So now I'm going to come down. I'm going to verify my result. You'll see it turns red because it is considered to be a critical result. So I'm going to verify this. Password again. And we get a little message. It says the result for the sodium level has exceeded defined critical limits. We need to put in a result comment or a result note. All right, it's doable. We can handle that. So click OK. It's going to bring up our little comment box here. So with our comment, we come down to the lower right, we say edit. We're going to use this handy thing that we call a word processing template. And that's going to allow us to have like a standard block of text that we can use over and over again. And so we get this critical result, like, okay, I got to call it to the physician, and I'm just going to do a little bit of covering my bases and say, yeah, I have called that physician. And if I type in CRIT, and then hit F9 on my keyboard. Now, if you are on some kind of laptop, you may have to do some interesting keyboard combinations. I know that on my device, if I was using like my just native keyboard, I'd have to do like a function and then F9. So you may have to figure out what's what there. But you do F9, and that should change that template so that it says critical results called to, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm going to fill in some blanks. Those little underscores are going to act as my blanks. And it says, we're going to say called to, well, Dr. Carter. Calling our results to the patient's doctor. Now, if you hit F3, it'll jump to the next underscore for you automatically. And then at, well, that wants like a date and time. So if I do an F5, look at all these function keys that we're using. And an F5, it's going to fill in the current date and time. And then another F3 to jump to my next underscore. So by, well, who did it? That would be me. So DL number. Okay, one more. Down here at the bottom, read back and verified. Yeah, they did. And that should be it. It should give me everything that I need there. I'll click OK. That's good. So I click close. And then my results verifies. Alrighty. So far, so good. Hopefully, any issues here before we go ahead and move on?
Yeah, I think I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm hitting close on the window, but it still comes up with you must enter a result comment. So I'm not sure what I'm doing.
Did
the comment? Yeah, I go back and it's still there.
Did you enter it like up at the top of that comment box? You'll see there's some tabs. Did it go in on either the result comment or the result note tab, or did it go over to the order tab?
It's under order comment.
That's why. So
okay.
It needs to actually be on the result, either result note or result comment. If it's on the order, then it doesn't care. It doesn't see that as being quote unquote done.
Okay, I missed that spot. I'll put that in. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have some issues? Okay, good deal. Alrighty. So then our last step here should be to go in and take a look at our results. So if you, excuse me, if we close out of this, actually, you don't even have to close. We can actually use one of our handy dandy branch buttons. Branch buttons are these things we have at the top of an application, usually, that allow us to jump to a different application without having to worry about going back to a like a folder or a desktop icon, similar to what we often achieve with the app bar. So those of you guys that have been end users before are probably familiar with the app bar. We are just not using it because I'd have to set it up for every single class, and that doesn't sound very fun to me. So let's just go ahead over to Order Result Viewer. And let's see, I'm going to put in my patient's name. And I can hopefully see that there's my order, there's my session. It is completed. That's what I was trying to achieve. I mentioned before that we have both an order list mode as well as a flow sheet mode in this tool. Most of the time, this ends up being the mode that a lot of people use. But if you go up to the top, you'll see there's a mode menu, and the second option in there says flow sheet. So if you switch that over, now you can see what the flow sheet would look like over in PowerChart. So I think this is pretty nifty because they actually give us like a view of the same thing that we would see on the PowerChart side. So even though oftentimes lab and lab and the clinicians, the doctors and nurses, they see different things. This way they can see the same thing. It's kind of nice that they did that. They snuck that in. I know they usually point it out during training, but someone have a question?
Yeah, I do. So
So,
there's a lot of times in the lab when you're trying to, you get a call from a provider, and they're
mm-hmm,
saying, "Where's my result?" And you're saying
mm-hmm,
it's in there, and then you're just on the phone arguing whether or not it's in there.
yep,
And most of the time it's a training issue on the provider's side
mm-hmm,
that they don't know how to view the results. So it's nice to be able to see this view.
yep. Absolutely. Yeah, it gets a little bit more complicated over in PowerChart because they have like different flow sheets that they can look at. So if it's like a PCP versus a cardiologist, they might see the results in a slightly different order. But this is a really easy way for us to say no. It really is there. And sometimes we do have issues where like we can see the results on the lab side, but you might have something like clinical validation in place where it does need to be reviewed by a like a supervisor or lab director or something. And so that may prevent results from appearing over on their side. And so this way you can say, oh, hey, it's it's not in the flow sheet actually. So I need to go light a fire under somebody to to get that reviewed, perhaps. So yeah, it's good that we can do this. I like that they did this. All right, so that should be everything, I do believe, in this particular application, this particular activity. I usually like to go ahead and pop this back over into order list mode. One thing that kind of a little preview, a little foreshadowing of what we'll talk about later is that what am I trying to say? My brain train just derailed somewhere. We are not going to be doing a lot of things around the event set hierarchy, mostly just due to time. So our results are not going to actually be popping up in that flow sheet mode for the most part. We are not going to actually be seeing that, but that's okay. I can remind us later if we run into any issues. Okay. Well, if we are good to go here, then what we will do is switch back over to PowerPoint. PowerPoint, where did you go? There you are. Time. And let me get this little bar guy out of the way. He's usually over here on my other monitor. Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to start here with our service resource hierarchy. Excuse me, can I get it out of the way? We are going to have a lot of things later on that end up being kind of dependent on our service resources. So I think it's a good place to start. It's one of the first things that we usually do start with when we're doing our lab builds. So this being a building and maintaining course, we are going to be talking about things kind of from both sides. So not only just the regular maintenance that we have to do, but also if I have to just build something from scratch. So The good news is a lot of times the steps are exactly the same, and maintenance is just a little bit easier because you have less to do. So that is going to make things a little bit better. Okay, so service resource hierarchy. There we go. Oh, look, another reminder about our locations. It's almost like they're really important. And they are. So, the main thing that we're going to care about in terms of our service resource hierarchy is just going to be that patient care hierarchy. And when I talk about patient care hierarchy, I'm just talking about the available locations within your health system, because they are going to be driving some of the things we talk about with the service resources, right? So when we say service resource, we are referring to the what can do our testing, let's put it that way. So what can do any and all of the possible tests for our various different, things we have in the lab. And we're also then going to be taking that and using that to say, okay, I've got all of these possible instruments, all these possible benches that can do my testing. Okay, what locations can they test? All right, so the that is going to be the other thing. And so those locations, of course, are going to come from the patient locations, right? So it all kind of comes together. All right, but let's start off simple. Let's start off with what the heck is a service resource? Well, a service resource is going to be made up of any place where work can be performed. And when we say work, of course, we're talking about testing, but we use that little bit more general definition because, fun fact, lab is not the only area that makes use of service resources. There are other departments within the health system that also make use of it. So we have this thing we call the service resource hierarchy that is going to provide a nice standardized list of all of these available options for our testing, not only for GenLab, but also for the other lab modules as well. So if we take a look at what makes up our service resources here, our service resource hierarchy, we begin at the top. We have this thing called an institution. So the institution is going to be equivalent to the facility. Right? So you have a facility. These are not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. All right, so you can have usually more facilities than you do institutions, because you're going to have plenty of facilities that that aren't going to actually have service resources. A lot of times things like clinics, outpatient centers, they will have they're going to be a facility. They have patient care and all that kind of fun stuff, but they don't have service resources. They don't need them. They send all the testing to the main hospital lab. So the institution would have to be a conscious choice that we make to go ahead and say, yes, we're going to go ahead and build that. But then once we have our institution, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next level, which is the department. In our case, the department is going to match up to the physical laboratory. Now, most of the time, I'd say that the each one of our institutions usually has just one lab. I wouldn't say always. I find when I speak in absolutes, there's always that person that says, well, actually, we have multiple labs at our hospital. Okay, that's why I say usually instead of always. But most of the time, each facility is probably just going to have one central lab. You might have like something like a remote draw location where you can do some actual blood sampling, but the actual service resources will only be found in one place. So that would be the physical lab. Now, if you do have more than one laboratory within your hospital, you very well may have more than one department to kind of represent that. So maybe you have like the central lab and then a respiratory therapy lab. You keep like an instrument or two there for respiratory therapy to do their blood gases and all of that. Okay, great. That could be a separate department. Mainly what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to have a nice organized way of looking at all of our service resources. So, and this is actually a good reminder for everything that we talk about. What we are going over in class is just Cerner's recommendations for your builds. Yours may be a little tiny bit different, and that's okay, right? That's fine. We're just kind of telling you how things most likely are gonna work the best. So anyway, enough about that. Moving on from our department, we're then going to have each section. So the sections are going to be the various different divisions of the laboratory, right? So this would be like your chemistry section, your hematology section, immunology section. So exactly which sections you end up with will kind of depend on the lab, because not every single lab necessarily does things exactly the same way. And some sites might have like a virology section. If you do dedicated virology testing, some may just group that together with immunology. So that is, there's a little bit of variability that could be there. Then we get to the subsection, and here we've got really even more variability, because you can have different purposes for the subsection. Remember, it all comes down to organization. And so the subsections that I see probably most commonly would be like, here's my chemistry section, and then I've got a chemistry automated subsection, and then I've got a chemistry manual subsection. That way I can easily group together, here's everything that I test on my instruments, and here's everything that I test at the bench. But that's just one possible option. The main thing that kind of goes into these decisions here, especially at the subsection level, is going to be, it's actually two things. So one is the way we want to be able to look at the groupings of resources in the usually pending inquiry would be the main place that we're using this. So yes, I might want to look at just one service resource at a time, but sometimes I may also want to look at things in more than one sort of grouping. So I want to see all of my chemistry instruments grouped together. I just want to see everything that's currently pending for chemistry, right? Well, instead of having to select each service resource one at a time, which sure you can do, awfully tedious though, I can instead select the entire subsection or even the section if I really wanted to do that. That is going to be one major thing, and the other is going to be reporting. So the daily reports, the management reports that we have, oftentimes those are also grouped by this level of the service resource hierarchy. So when you want to look at like a daily activity report or a correction report, you may not want to just pull in one service resource at a time. You may want to look at larger groupings. So those are kind of the two main decision points. But there can be others, of course, that go into those subsections. But you'll see when we pull up the train domain examples here that we do commonly use things like automated versus manual as our main groupings at that point. And then finally, we get down to the very bottom of our service resource hierarchy with the instruments and or benches. Now, this is going to sound super duper obvious, but when you're building out a service resource, you need to make sure you select the proper option. So if it's an instrument, you build it as an instrument. If it's a bench, you build it as a bench. You'll be like, well, duh, that makes sense. Of course it does. But you'd be surprised how often I've seen it done that something it's a piece of instrumentation, but we say, oh, well, we're not going to be creating an interface for this, so we'll just build it out as whatever. And someone ends up building it as a bench. It's like, okay. Just because you're not interfacing it today or this year doesn't mean you don't change your mind in a couple of years. And now you're trying to interface a bench, which, spoiler alert, is impossible. And so now you have to go back and you have to rebuild the whole thing, and everybody's going to be sad about that. It is not at all an enjoyable experience. So, moral of this story, make sure it matches up. The reason that's so important is because you can't switch it. There's no way to switch it after the fact. Once it's saved that way forever. Now, names, that's easy. That we can fix. It's just the indicator that says this is an instrument versus this is a bench. We can't change that. Now, something that, to my knowledge, is still fairly unique to GenLab. I haven't run into these being used in other parts of the lab just yet, although I am often one of the last to find out about certain things. They're going to be these things called multiplexers. Now, multiplexer is a term that we here at Cerner use, but most of you guys have probably heard it as a different name. I've heard these called data managers. I've heard them called very confusingly, middleware, which is awkward because we have middleware in our Millennium system that is completely different. But essentially what it is it's a piece of software. It's not really a physical device per se. It's software that links together multiple different instruments. And so instead of the tech having to make each choice about, well, this test goes to this service resource, this test goes to this service resource, the data manager does it for them. It's almost like it's directing traffic. So when we're building out our GenLab system, we're dealing with all of these different instruments and interfaces and all that. We would build out this data manager as this thing we call a multiplexer. It's going to be built at the subsection level. Right? So this is one additional use of that subsection. And so I'd say, okay, here's my Clinitech, I think is one of the brands that makes these. There's a bunch of them out there. And then underneath that, I list out each one of the instruments. When I go to do the build for my interfaces, I actually only need to interface the multiplexer. Now, you could build out individual instrument interfaces if there was a reason for that. Maybe you only use the multiplexer on certain days of the week. So in that case, you might have to have the instruments there. But usually it's just a single interface rather than 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 individual ones, which does make things a bit simpler. However, when we do the build side, we do want to build the entries in the service resource hierarchy for the individual instruments because mainly the QC is not done by the multiplexer. The QC is done by the individual instruments. And we want to be able to have those QC statistics for each individual instrument. So it'll still send its results through the multiplexer, but we actually record it at the instrument level. So that is something that we do pretty commonly run into with GenLab. If you got a bunch of instruments in the lab, you very likely are running them through something like that. And again, they can have different names. They get all sorts of different brand names, but we just kind of group them all together and call it a multiplexer. Now, each one of our service resources are going to need this thing called a specimen login location. I kind of alluded to this earlier. This is going to be a singular location where that specimen needs to get to in its journey to be considered in lab. Right, Millennium, it's a pretty nifty system. It can do an awful lot, but it's not artificial intelligence. It's not doing like RFID tracking of each one of our specimen tubes. I mean, who knows? We might get there someday, but I don't think we're there yet. So when we are tracking the specimen, we're doing it manually. All right, so typical workflow would be something like the phlebotomist goes up to the floor, they're doing their collections. If they're using power chart specimen collection and using that workflow, then they could go ahead and mark it as collected right there at the bedside. If not, they're just going to put everything in their little cart or their little basket, and then they're going to take everything down to the lab, and then it's all going to get logged in. Right? Most labs have something like a central processing. I might call it something a bit different, but everything kind of goes through that main area, and you're going to log it all in and distribute it where it needs to go, right? These tubes need to go to chemistry. This stuff needs to go over to micro. This needs to go over to blood bank. Right? We have that central processing login. So I might say, once that specimen gets to central processing, I know that it's in the lab. Right? It's physically in the laboratory, which means that it's good to go. It's ready for testing. And for most organizations, that's probably fine. So once you actually get it logged into that central processing type place, it's in its quote unquote in lab location. That's what we designate it as. Some workflows you may have, you go an extra step. Micro would be a good exception here, where because we have extra things we have to do to prep those micro tests, you got to put them in the right media and all this kind of jazz. Micro has its own separate login. So a lot of times, you'll process it through central processing, goes over to micro, and then micro has to do an additional login step. We don't usually need to do that for the other areas of the lab. You could have like a chemistry login as kind of like an extra security, well, not security, but assurance step that now it's been logged into chemistry, so it's ready to go. It's usually considered too much work, because that's just one extra login that your med techs working in chemistry would have to do. So most of the time, something like central processing will work as your in-lab location. But ultimately, we're going to mirror that up to the workflow. But each and every one of our service resources, that be instruments, that be benches, that be those multiplexers too, has to have this in-lab location. Because as we saw, if the test is not in its in-lab location, then we can't enter any results. It literally says, nope, sorry, you don't get to do this. And so if we didn't have an in-lab location for an order, then it just kind of is stuck. You can't like go back in and you can't go in and grandfather it in with, oh, whoops, we forgot to add a specimen login location. I mean, you can go in and fix it, but any existing orders are not going to pick up on that. So very easy to identify when we're doing troubleshooting, just you can't enter any results, but definitely something that we don't want to miss because it ends up being a hard stop in the workflow. The good news is that these don't change all that much. Like I said, most of the time, central processing is a good choice, and once you set it up, you're good to go. All right, next we have the laboratory location. This little data entry thing has, I don't know, it's weird. It has many different names in the system. And I can never find like one clear and concise term for it out in the reference pages. So I call it a laboratory location. In the tool, it's just going to list it as laboratory. There's so many different things we call laboratory in the system. It gets very, very confusing. So that's why I say it's the physical laboratory location. Where is my lab physically found? Well, in other words, what's its address? Well, why does this matter? There are, I think, for each of the major areas of the lab, various different CAP regulations, our good old friends at the College of American Pathologists, that say you need to have a physical location for each of your results. Now, for those of you guys that are up in Canada, I would imagine you probably have something similar. I don't know our own U.S. regulations by heart. There's just too many of them. But I think Canada does have something in a similar fashion. But you could double check all of your documentation as to exactly what its verbiage is. But anyway, what it's basically saying is, where did this physically take place? It's just like it's a reporting thing. It actually mostly affects clinical reporting, because they're going to have that on like various different chart expedites and things like that. When they're doing like printouts of the patient's chart, they need that little data point in there. For a very long time, we had an issue where the tool that we use to do all this build, it's the appropriately named location tool, it didn't actually allow us to add that address to the service resource. And actually, it still doesn't. And so the regulations say have an address for each service resource, but the tool says, sorry, no can do. Well, it's because the tool is a lot older than those regulations. And so we were kind of stuck. It's like, well, how do I meet this requirement? And so what ended up happening, we'd have this little workaround where you create this laboratory entry in the database, associate the physical address to that. And then because of how the relationships in the database work, you've got lab location with the address, associate that to the service resource. Service resource does the test, ta-da, now the result has an address associated to it. Yay, Cap is happy. Well, they changed that relatively recently. I don't know exactly how recently this has been adjusted. It's something that Ilona and I, as our other lab instructor, discovered rather by accident, because she was looking up something on one of the reference pages and noticed that this said, wait a second, this is different than it's always been. So as far as we can tell, this was actually something that was kind of slipped in as an update by the clinical reporting folks. Because like I said, this mostly is going to affect the clinical reporting side. Yes, it's a regulation for us, but they're the ones that are going to be seeing this most of the time. We check the box that says, yes, I've done this, but they actually will have it popping up on their end to have all of their proper documentation. So what they ended up doing is they changed the tool just a little bit. And so now up at the department level, you can actually now add the address to the department. Lots and lots of years we could not do that. But now they've kind of fixed it. And so what we're seeing, and there hasn't actually been any like official like notification about this, which is kind of weird. But what they're doing is they're having us put the address now up at the department level, and that now does something better for the clinical reporting side. I am not a clinical reporting expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's something that changed on their end in terms of how things are actually like printing out to those chart expedites. And so they wanted it kind of fewer steps away, I guess, from the actual results. So now we can put the address at the department level, and this laboratory location thing is sort of superfluous. I haven't heard anything about us having to remove it, so I don't think we're going to have to. Now, of course, they can change their minds. But if you were to get some kind of, hey, I need you to do this, the only thing that's changed is we just go to the department, the Baseline West Laboratory, and you right-click on it, you select the address, you put in the address, and that's it. Entering an address is probably one of the easiest build tasks that we could possibly have. But I've also heard from folks that actually have had this show up as something that they've had done, that their clinical reporting folks did it. And they just added it, didn't say anything, and it all works. So entirely possible that may happen to you as well. But I wanted to kind of bring it to your attention. I still need to update my slide. We've got another round of domain and course updates coming up here pretty soon. So I'll probably put a link to a little blurb that we found out in the reference page. But like I said, I haven't heard anything like officially official come out about this, which probably means that it's kind of just sliding under the radar. I hate it when that happens, but it does happen occasionally. But like it could also just be something that they're really just letting clinical reporting take the lead on it, just something that happens to affect us as well. So long story short, we still need to have an address on our results. We still can keep that laboratory location in there. As far as I know, we don't need to change that part. But you may have to, or your clinical reporting folks may have to, add the address at the department level. Sounds complicated, but it's really not. And then one last thing, very, very important for our service resources, is going to be the service resource calendar. That's a good question. There's a question there in the chat. If you had the address in both the laboratory and the department, does it appear twice? I think it would probably have to do with the way the clinical reporting template is set up. And see, this is the part that we don't really know, because we've talked to like the knowledge leads that we have for for GenLab, and they're kind of just as clueless as we are. So one of these days, I need to track down one of the clinical reporting folks that actually knows why this is being done, and get a little bit more information. But it's like, if you guys have ever tried to find one singular person that has like the decision-making power, it's very, very difficult. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it puts it in twice, because there should just be like one space in the template that they use to put the address in there. So wherever the address needs to print to, there should just be one place for it. I think what's just changed is that where that spot goes in the database to find the information has been updated. That's my understanding of it so far. So it should only pull one in. It's just now updating where it pulls from, if that makes sense. And I mean, I would assume that the address would be the same in both places, or you would want it to be the same in both places. It'd be more just, they would say, oh, it's not appearing there where it needs to be. So then that it hasn't been added at that department level yet. But that's why I say I don't think we're going to have to go in and remove those laboratories, because it shouldn't affect anything as far as I know. Now, if that changes, of course, hopefully they'll actually put out a blurb that clients need to update their builds. But like I said, I don't think that's going to be changing anything. But who knows? I know that Oracle has some big ideas, with a capital B, about updates to our system. So that's probably low on their to-do list. But hey, all sorts of crazy things could change. The short answer to your question is, it should just be once in there. There shouldn't be pulling in multiple addresses. All right, so service resource calendar. What this is going to do is it's going to define when and where and how my service resource is available. Now, for much of your lab, it's probably everything is used 24/7, 365. You don't have any like specific dates and times that certain resources are used. But that's not always the case. So you may have, say, certain service resources that are only used on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. It'd be kind of weird, but hey, I've seen weirder stuff happen. So we would define that in the service resource calendar and say, well, we use this particular resource from Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And what the system will do is it'll look at the order when it comes through and say, okay, I need to go to this service resource. Is it going to match that schedule that we have? It's really what the calendar is. And if it does, great, it'll use that service resource. But let's say it's 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. Well, we can't use that service resource on that day. And so it would try and jump to another service resource. So it's days and times. Those are probably the most obvious, but you'll also have patient ages. Now, if you do have certain service resources that are only used for certain patient ages, maybe like pediatric testing, then you can define age ranges in there. The service area, we've already kind of talked a little bit about, which is the locations. That's probably the part of the build that may change the most of these calendars for you guys. Like I said, most labs, you're probably doing a 24/7 sort of thing, where everything is on all the times, always being available for whatever tests it can do. But what changes is which locations those service resources will be testing for, especially if you've got a multi-facility system. But we can also put in reporting priorities, so whether something is a stat versus a routine versus a time study, and then specimen types. And I will say with specimen types specifically, It is usually easier to control that via the collection requirements, and we'll talk about those later in the week. But with each order, you're going to designate which specimens can be tested for each order. We do a lot of blood testing, we do a lot of urine testing, and everything in between. So if you've already got it limited at the orderable level, because of the way lab orders specifically in our system work, if we haven't designated that as an available specimen in our build, they're not going to be able to select it in PowerChart. So if the only specimen you've made available to a test is blood, that's the only option they get. So you're not going to run into an issue where the service resource is trying to test, I don't know, a stool sample for a CBC. Well, unlikely. So we usually just go ahead and say all specimen types, just leave it at that. Sometimes when you try and get too fancy with the build, it's a lot harder to keep track of. So you can technically say, well, this particular service resource can only do blood testing and urine testing. Well, then another thing you have to consider is, okay, we've got a urine specimen, but what about the urine clean catch and the urine suprapubic and the petty bag and all of the other urine specimens? Same thing with blood. You can have just regular old whole blood. You can have an arterial draw. You can have cord blood. And so, yeah, you got to have to account for all of those. A lot easier to do for doing your collection requirements than to do for the service resource. So we'll talk about those a little bit later. Like I said, when we get into building our orders. So to give you an example, there's a lot that's going on here with these calendars. And I like to kind of give you one example that I've run into over the course of my teaching. And this actually happened not too terribly long ago. It's about a year or so ago, when we're not quite as busy here on our team, which doesn't happen often. We will sometimes get roped in to help with the end user training. And sometimes we'll get asked to help with the go lives for clients. And so it's something different, something more exciting to do than just teaching all day, every day. So a lot of us will jump at the chance. And I think it's actually a good learning opportunity for instructors because you get to see what the end users are doing. So I went on a conversion, I believe it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. And they had a very interesting setup for the particular lab that I was assigned to. So being a lab nerd for so many years, they like to stick me in the lab. And this particular health system, they had, I think it was like 4 or 5 hospitals of varying sizes. But they had, as is common, like one main hospital. And then some smaller like community hospitals. The location that I was assigned to was previously like a pretty small hospital. I forget how many beds it used to have, but essentially when COVID hit, the combination of like budgeting and staffing and the need for quarantine, they couldn't keep the inpatient side of the hospital open. So that part of the hospital got converted to a variety of different just like doctors' offices. There was a part of it that was now a Y, like YMCA, which was interesting. So that side of the hospital wasn't open anymore. However, the hospital had also had a pretty small little ED, an emergency department, and they kept that open. So essentially they took an inpatient hospital and converted it into urgent care, but it was officially an emergency department, not your typical, like minute clinic. And they left the lab there as well. That's what I'm trying to get at. So you've got this ED, they had like something like 9 or 10 beds, wasn't really big. And then they had the lab across the hall, basically just to do testing for the ED. And so what they would do is any of the tests that could be performed there in that lab. It was a relatively small lab. They could do most of your basic chemistry and hematology and, the usual stuff that you'd see the ED doc ordering. They had the basic stuff that they could do for blood bank. They kept a handful of blood units there for the emergency transfusions. But anything that was like a more complex type of test, anything that was micro, anything that would need like the complex workups for blood bank, those would all have to go over to the main hospital because they just didn't have the testing equipment there. So on the first level, they would only have certain orderables that could be tested. Now that's work routing, we usually call work routing, and that's done at the orderable level. So we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to that part of our bill. But the other interesting thing that they did with their service resource calendar is that they had to configure their locations, their service areas, in other words, so that only those like very, very small subset of locations, those ED locations, would be tested in that lab. So every place else, they say, nope, can't do testing for, it can only be this one little bitty lab. Because they wouldn't accept send outs in, and they would only send things out. So their service resources, the couple of simple little analyzers that they had for their CBCs and their panels and things, they would only test for these 9 or 10 ED beds. And so they had a very specific setup just for that. Another thing that was also kind of interesting is that those orderables would have to be stat orders, which is usual in the ED. But if one of the docs had accidentally ordered something as a routine, or if they said, no, I want this to be a time study, well, their calendar was set up to say, nope, we can't do those in-house. They have to be sent out. Now, whether that was something that they wanted to do or whether it was just the docs not knowing exactly what they were supposed to do, it was a go live. So yeah, people make some little mistakes. That's easy enough to fix. Then we kind of cross that bridge. But that was the other major way that they were kind of using the service resource calendar to their advantage, is saying, okay, I'm going to use the this one specific reporting priority is really the only one that I can do, stat testing. Everything else has to go over to the main lab. And then they'd also use those locations within the service area. So it's actually pretty much the main thing that we see these days in terms of calendars, is figuring out, okay, which locations are we going to be testing? So we've got all these different facilities and all these different labs, which reporting priorities are going to be tested. And then, of course, the orderables, which is done in the work routing build, which is separate. So I thought that was a very nifty thing that I got to see in real life. Because, it's one thing when you're teaching a lot of these classes and talking about Cerner's model recommendations, you don't really necessarily see what's going on out there in the real world. So that was a nifty little experience I got. I'm like, oh, I can make this relevant to my classes. I was so happy. Excuse me. Sorry about that. All right. And then this is just a little bit more about those service areas. Service area grouping, of locations. Specifically, that's going to be inpatient locations, any outpatient locations, as well as your specimen login locations. Sometimes that gets forgotten if we're having to design new service areas. So if a test is already in the lab, a specimen is already in the lab, and we're doing like on a session add-on, because the doc calls and say, whoops, I forgot, then that also needs to be accounted for as a location where the specimen could be. So each and every one of the places where a patient could be located, or a specimen could be located, and that we are going to be doing lab testing for, has to be in a service area. That is the one tricky thing with service areas, is each location can only be in a single one. Now you can have a service resource that can do testing for multiple service areas. So go back to my example, their main hospital lab probably was associated to all of the different service areas, because all their little smaller community hospitals had a similar setup, like a smaller lab that would do your basic tests, and then the more complex ones get sent in. So each location can only be in one service area. That's so that we're not sending the system conflicting instructions. So you can't say, on one hand, I need you to go to the smaller lab, and then on the other hand, I need you to go at the big lab, main hospital lab, at the same time. It's not possible, right? So the other thing that I always like to remind folks about when it comes to the service areas is that these need to get updated. Like, whenever new locations are added to your health system, hopefully someone remembers to do this. There was a client I was talking to years ago in one of my classes, and they said, oh yeah, we had that problem. We just bought a new hospital in our health system, and nobody remembered to actually build a service area for them until we started doing all the testing of all of the orders, and nothing was working. It's like, yeah, you gotta actually do that, a little bit of maintenance there. So that would be the other, just very, very gentle little reminder, is whenever new locations are added to the health system, whether they be inpatient, outpatient, or lab locations, if we're going to be doing testing, they need to be in a service area somewhere. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues. All right. Service areas are always fun to talk about. I think they're one of the things that we deal with a lot in Gen Lab, simply because we usually have so many different instruments, but then we also have the manual benches for manual testing, and a lot of sites these days are multi-facility organizations, and so you kind of have to figure out, okay, which lab is doing which tests. So I like to go into a fair bit of detail with service resources, because we have to mess with them so often. So any other questiones related to our service resources? Not at the moment. Okay. So what I like to do is kind of go through some slides and use that as my pseudo demo of the build, and then we'll go through and do the actual build activity together as a group. So we're going to kind of take a little bit of a look-see here at the tool that we're going to be using. And I know we've only got about 10 minutes until our lunch break, so this will be a nice little thing. We'll kind of introduce the idea of this location tool, and then when we come back, we'll actually get to do some build. So first thing I thought to throw in here is the specimen login location. We're not going to be building one of these for our activities, but just in case you ever had such a task come across your to-do list, you would know where to go. Excuse me. So specimen login locations are in the same tool we use for the rest of this, which is the location tool. In the location tool, you're going to have these different tabs here on the left-hand side. So it always opens up to this location hierarchy. This is where your patient care locations are going to be found. We don't really care about this unless we're just having to look something up. We care more about either the resource hierarchy, which is where our service resources live, and then this location views is like miscellaneous stuff. Some of this ancillary type build that still relevant, but not technically a service resource. Specimen login locations would fit the bill. So we come in here, go to our location views, and then here's my specimen login location section. Add login location. And it's just a simple description, display, and then it does have you associate the organization where this is going to be found. So just a quick little relationship there for the database mostly, so it knows where to tie everything together. So that's pretty simple. If you ever need to adjust the name of a specimen login location, you just come in and modify it instead of building a new one. This is that laboratory location that I was mentioning, so it just shows you where that can be found. So should they ever change their minds and say that we need to do something different with these, this is where you can find them. So same basic place under this location views section. Just gets a description and display and an address. One thing to keep in mind with any address really that we talk about, unless otherwise specified, they need to be a business address. Millennium is kind of tricky in that regard that we have multiple different address types. And because of the way the database works and the way it pulls back information, it does actually say that, say your business address could be different than your mailing address. It's kind of annoying. But our applications, the various different regulations that we might be having to follow related to addressing, it's all business address. Other solutions might be different, but we do business. All right, then service resources. So they're going to be here under this resource hierarchy tab. And then here we can see, we expand our various different levels. So institution, departments, sections. GenLab is special. GenLab gets to have multiple different sections, whereas pathology, blood bank, micro, they're all just one section each. But we get the chemistry, the coag, the hematology, immunology, send outs, urinalysis. Lots of different sections that we have. So just make sure we go to the correct section, and then you navigate this tool with a lot of right clicking. So you right click on the appropriate subsection, go to add, bench, or instrument here. And then what you're going to need is really just this stuff up here at the top. So description, display, discipline type is equivalent to your catalog type. So laboratory, activity type, of course, is general lab. Activity subtype, it's not technically required, but it's a good idea just for database purposes. You'll have chemistry instruments versus immunology instruments. If it's something that can do multiple different types of tests, then you could just pick one. It's not going to affect how the service resource works, but it'll affect, like when I'm doing my work routing in Bedrock, you'll see that there's like a sub-activity type filter. And you can say, oh, I only want to see my chemistry instruments, and then it'll narrow down the list. So that's really the main thing that it uses that for. Location, of course, is that lab location that we talked about. And then the specimen login location. All this stuff down here at the bottom doesn't really... Well, okay, so there's a couple of exceptions. Maybe clear this up here a little bit. If you were building out one of those data managers, there would be another checkbox down here for the multiplexer. I don't think it shows up here because this is an instrument. Does not show up here. So that would have a checkbox, but those, it's not like we're building those every day. If you have a robotics line, so one of those where you just stick the tube in, it just do down the fancy little robot, and it auto logins your specimen, you can check that box. So instead of us having to log in each and every one of the specimen tubes, the robotics line does it for you. Check that box. That allows that to happen. The rest of these, they don't really... The dispatch, download, and download a collect. Last I knew, they hadn't worked all the kinks out of that functionality. I think I put one of the reference pages linked there in the notes. You can read up on that if you really need to. And then point of care device. The point of care device thing used to apply to making a service resource available for point of care result entry, as a separate result entry application. I think they've kind of phased that out, and they've kind of switched up how the workflow is done, because what the issue we used to run into is you've got the nurses that are the ones using the point of care devices, usually, and they're not used to logging in to lab applications, and point of care result entry is a lab application. And so there will be issues, and I don't know what the heck I'm doing. And so they actually have kind of moved the point of care workflows over into PowerChart, last I knew. So that, as far as I'm aware, that's the only thing that point of care device would be affecting. You can mark it. I mean, if it is a point of care device, you can mark it as a POC device, but I don't think we're so much using that as much. Okay, and then service resource calendar. So I right click on my service resource, go to calendar, fill in the various different tabs. General tab is going to be your days of the week, time and age, as it states, times of the day, patient ages. And then the routing is our service areas, reporting priorities, and specimen types. And there we go. So let's just go ahead and go to lunch. And I will see you guys back here at 1 p.m. Central Time. I'll bring back up my handy little timer so that we all